Hello, everyone. Settler's Lament here, now with a new and improved microphone, hopefully. And today, I think this is relatively self-explanatory. We're going to be talking about the... And once again, I forgot to mute the stream in the background. Every time. Please don't spam in the chat for those who are spamming. But yes, today we will be discussing the myth of the popular revolution. That's what I was trying to say. And so this is, I think this is a relatively well-known topic within our circles. Basically, it's the idea that revolutions are often sold to us as some sort of expression of the demos, that the people got upset over some ruling class doing bad things to them, and then the people just rose up and overthrew them. The reality is, of course, in many, if not all situations, it's much more complex than that. And it is rarely, if ever, the genuine expression of a popular will, even if the concept of popular will means anything. And of course, when we think of revolution, we generally think of the more tumultuous revolutions like the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution. But this also, I think, is applicable to peaceful revolutions and peaceful political changes that are happening now and happening more regularly. This, of course, the term revolution is quite interesting. Our minds probably mostly go to the type of revolutions that I just mentioned, but there are many ways we use that term. We talk about political revolutions not infrequently. Even Bernie Sanders used that term a lot in his campaign. And you talk about stuff like the Industrial Revolution. I'm reading a book right now for my Subscribe stars called James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution. They asked me to do it, which I'll have a review on soon, hopefully. But yes, so revolution is an interesting concept, and it's a lot more broad than the sort of revolutions that our minds probably initially go to. Yeah, so I mean that's the basic topic that we're going to be discussing today. Would anyone like to take it from me?
Yeah, I'll take it first. So I think one of the major revolutions that has happened in the United States that was a peaceful revolution, and this is probably the classic NRX example, would be the revolution that happened under the FDR regime, which is where Mencius Moldbug identifies the end of the Third Republic, I believe, and beginning of the Fourth. So from the neo-reactionary perspective, we basically view America as having several regimes. The one we're currently in, and probably at the tail end of, actually, is the FDR regime, which had two phases: the time that FDR was alive, and from the time he died till now, the FDR regime, in which he was no longer alive, and it was continued on by his successors. And FDR fundamentally changed how the federal government governed the United States, with no civil or even international conflict for a large part of that shift in how the federal government operated, particularly in its outward perspective, but also in the number of bureaucracies in the United States, the number of university professors and other such persons, intellectuals who were involved in the government. We shifted very much into the brain trust, intellectual, scientific government model during the FDR regime, completely changing the mode by which America was governed without actually having to fire a shot, so to speak.
Yeah, that is the FDR revolution. Of course, Moldbug's idea is that there's been essentially 4 different American republics, I believe, if I remember correctly. The Articles of Confederation, the Constitution, the or is it more? Then there was the Civil War, and then there was the FDR. So yeah, that's 4. Unless I'm counting wrong, I think so. Moving on, but yes. So yeah, and that is actually the topic of the book that I said I'm reading, more slowly than I should, but whatever. James Burnham's The Managerial Revolution. This is something which Academic Agent actually refers to relatively frequently, or at least the general concept when he's talking about the managerial elite. And like I said, a full review of that will be coming up soon. But it's an interesting book. It's basically saying what we more or less, a lot of us probably are relatively aware of, that starting with around the time of the New Deal, the real locus of power was shifting away from the capitalists and towards the permanent bureaucracies in Washington and other areas. And he says this is a new form of government and a new form of social organization called the managerial state. And this sort of government means that the people that really control how society is run is this civil service, and it's taking power away from the old ruling class, the capitalists. Again, a full review of the book will be coming later. My main issue with it is he doesn't seem to, he explicitly says that he believes the end goal of this will be the government controlling the entire economy. And I know that, I know some libertarians would say that is where we are right now, but that doesn't seem like in the most accurate way of summarizing what the current economic system in the West is like. But yes, it certainly is a very vast change in social organization from before the New Deal and since then. And to get to the sort of point of the stream, the myth of the popular revolution, I think we have identified relatively well that the FDR, the New Deal and stuff, this was a sort of social revolution, but was it a popular revolution? Get to the point of this. And this, we see really well to anyone that cares to learn the basics of the FDR era, that despite how FDR is often portrayed as this great democratic leader, he was by really any reasonable standard a dictator. If America has ever had a dictator, he is the most likely candidate. There are of course a couple other candidates, but he is probably the most likely one. Just overriding the Supreme Court.
He wanted to pack the court, right?
Yeah. Threatening to pack it so he could override the court, so he could ignore what they were saying. He was at the very least a very authoritarian figure in American history, and it's often sold as this sort of popular revolution. But the reality is that this was FDR and other figures in the government taking control of how they wanted the society to be run. Even more blatantly, this is again another thing Burnham talks about, is a platform that FDR had ran on was a small government platform. It was a traditional classical liberal conservative platform, and he did the exact opposite of everything he promised. I know we're used to politicians doing the opposite of what they promise, but the FDR election was a particularly stunning way of it's not just a little bit; it was entirely the other way.
Yeah, I just wanted to observe the interesting kind of doublethink how progressives tend to square this circle of them supposedly being supportive of democratic grassroots policy revolutions, while also having an unfailing faith and trust in the experts and the bureaucracies and the professorial class. So it's interesting how they always seem to interpret anytime the public does something that contradicts the experts and the bureaucracies and those people that they trust. Anytime there's a grassroots movement for that, they'll identify it as populism, which is completely different from democracy, of course. And it's just interesting to observe that the progressives, although they like to democratize everything, worker co-ops, they want to lower the voting age to 16. That's coming soon, I promise. They always seem to have a very elitist streak, kind of this bourgeoisie superiority complex that goes along with it. So I just found that interesting. And it's, of course, very clear how that works post New Deal era, in that they have unfailing trust in bureaucrats and the academics, even when they contradict the majority public support of any issue.
Well, I think Orwell, said that the problem with socialists is that they hate the rich more than they love the poor. And but I think since we already talked about James Burnham, I think another great book of his, The Machiavellians, has another good piece of wisdom when it comes to the popular revolution, because in that he talks about the concept of the iron law of oligarchy, which is actually a relatively normie concept. If you go into political science classes, you might hear about it. But the iron law of oligarchy is basically the idea that no matter what type of government you think you have in your country, what you actually have is an oligarchy, because no one man can run a country and no true democracy can rule 330 million people. At the end of the day, you're always going to have to hand over rule of the country to a small group of semi-competent people who are going to wield the majority of the power, and they're going to be the ones that steer the country. And so Burnham says that really the story of most countries that we think of, if we think back to Rome or other famous stories through history, what we're really thinking about is the story of their elites, the culture of their elites, the actions of their elites. These are the people who really drive the narrative and control the country. And so if there is going to be a revolution inside the country, it doesn't generally come from the people. It comes from one set of disenfranchised elites wanting to take over from the current set of elites. It almost never comes from the actual population of the country.
Yeah, that's a good point. That reminds me, I forgot. I'm sure everyone watching knows who Iron Charlemagne is, but Aaron here has his own channel, and you should all subscribe to it. And hopefully you all know who Reaction is. He's been around here a couple times, but he also has his own channel. You should subscribe to that too. So I just wanted to shill for both of them quick.
So I was thinking about a few revolutions that come to mind before the stream started out. I mean, one of the obvious ones, or several of the obvious ones, are all in the late Roman Republic, right? And when we think about these revolutions, we're never thinking about even the particular people in the political factions so much as we are the elites, be it the Gracchi or Marius and Sulla, or the Pompeians and the Caesarians, Cassius and Brutus, senators themselves, right? None of these people are plebeians in any way. These are always the elites we're thinking about, even the ones who were apparently on the side of the populares, like Caesar was, right? His faction ultimately ended up solidifying into the empire, which had very little to do with the plebeian people, right? So, and it's the same in pretty much any revolution. I mean, again, French Revolution, that's another great example of a violent revolution. You have at the end of the revolution, when Napoleon is in power, of course, you have many of the aristocrats and generals were executed, but many others were still serving. Some were pardoned. Some of the revolutionary elites were marshals in Napoleon's military. So, of course, at the end of the day, it's not that the popular the lower class people came to power in any way. It's just the elite shifted. On Academic Agent Stream the other day, we were talking about a separation of powers, and we touched on the idea of separation of powers sort of amplifying the number of opportunities for corruption, and it's better that power is not divided like that. But of course, even if you have a monarchy, right, power is still going to be divided, because the monarch just cannot ultimately govern everything by themselves. There simply has to be an oligarchy at the top. So it seems to me the best way to avoid these seemingly always dangerous popular revolutions, and part of the myth is that they're a good thing, but I think it's pretty clear that they're not. The best way to avoid that seems to actually be to have a very solid oligarchy where you don't have factionalism vying for power. You want one oligarchy, not multiple of them undermining each other.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I would say, in my opinion, it would be. I prefer the term that the king would be delegating power down to these several factions, instead of in our liberal democratic systems, we have this kind of meme that they're dividing the power between these different branches, when really there's an organic consensus behind doors. But yeah, and I also like how you were mentioning the elite Roman factions that were happening in the middle of the chaos, the civil wars that they were having, and how they were having a significant influence on the outcome. And I just want to pose this question, because we were thinking about it in a Discord chat once. Has there ever been a completely peasant revolution, a completely popular revolution that succeeded? Or has there always been an elite faction competing to more like a coup? Has there ever been a situation like that?
I was trying to think of one.
Would the Haitian Revolution qualify?
Sorry?
Would the Haitian Revolution qualify?
I think that one would.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a good example, I think.
Yeah, because you can think of like the servile wars in Rome with Spartacus and such, but obviously while those were relatively genuinely led by the slaves and obviously weren't coming from the elites, none of those truly succeeded. So really, the only one that comes to mind that actually succeeded to some extent would have been, in my mind, the Haitian one.
Could we say that Napoleon's? It was during the Napoleonic era, correct? Could we say that his opponents, keeping him busy in Europe and him unable to handle the Haitians as technically indirectly being a rogue elite, that helped them?
I think that's always going to.
It's been a while since I read about the Haitian Revolution, but I'm pretty sure the English directly helped them. If I remember correctly.
Well, nonetheless, it appears that the Haitian Revolution has been much more grassroots relative to any other revolution, and it seems like there's a nice trend of the more grassroots and purely peasant the revolution is, the more brutal and violent and chaotic it is.
Yes, that's very true. It was from the bit that I did read on it once, it was particularly disgusting. Stuff you more or less would expect. There's one relatively well-known, I can't remember if it was a book or an article, but called The Black Jacobins. This was written in the 1900s, and it, again, from what I remember, this was a few years ago, it appeared to be celebrating the brutalities that the Haitian people did against the former ruling class. So I know that's just a little window into the depravity of leftist academia, that they celebrate that type of violence to this day. Or it's an old writing, like I said, but still. But yes, it. Like I said, even there clearly, or as Reaction said, there clearly was a global context going on that, if not for the disruption caused by the French Revolution and the subsequent wars, it's very unlikely that revolution would have resulted in the independent Haiti that it did result in. But yeah, so. There were, of course, many slave revolts, and they almost all were unsuccessful at achieving what Haiti did manage to achieve.
Yeah, just looking at the Wikipedia article, it does look like Britain and Spain were both involved in the conflict against France. So I think that is a good counterpoint there. Although I would still classify this as probably a successful, fundamentally peasant or a slave, whatever, led revolution. So I suppose there are good examples of it actually working, right?
But again, even then, it's the counterpoint is that even if the revolution was popular, the result was the installation of a new ruling class.
Yeah, exactly, and obviously extremely violent as well. There's probably no example we can think of that is a non-violent popular revolution. I would imagine. I certainly can't think of one.
No, and you definitely have your examples like you're talking about with the Gracchi brothers, and then Caesar taking up the popular cause. And even though in general, I think they were interested in land reform, they really were looking, to help out many of the lower classes in Rome. Ultimately, the main motive was to secure power. And obviously, we saw the civil wars that continued. In fact, much of Octavian's rise to power post him defeating Anthony is basically just the exhaustion of the people with the civil war and just being desperately happy that anyone would just be able to take over and institute peace. And even though he did institute many of the reforms to help out the average person in the Roman Empire, or at least reduce the power of the Senate and the aristocracy to some extent, in the end, you're always going to have a new ruling class, and they actually end up securing even more power than existed before.
I think it's also clear that the United States has this fundamental concept of the Revolutionary War being a sort of popular revolt against the tyrannical monarch. But of course, really what was going on there was another rotation of elites where you had these detached, some of them Republican elites detached from the English Parliament who basically wanted to take complete sovereignty over the United States from Britain. And it was absolutely fundamentally driven by their motivations, some of their writings, and not by the peasant farmers and other type of people living in the United States at the time. So yet again, we have at the core of the American mythos, it really is simply another oligarchical rotation.
The best argument for feudalism is the ascendancy of the bourgeoisie.
What do you mean by that exactly?
Because both the French and the American Revolution were technically, you might say, middle class revolutions, where it's this ascended bourgeoisie that has enough property to think that they should take part in major decisions, perhaps, for example, in America, controlling commerce and trade. And they end up being the new middle that competes to take out high. I'm thinking of Samo Berger's book about power analysis, where the relation between high, middle, and low is interesting, and only middle is able to challenge high. So this new ascendant bourgeoisie would not exist in feudalism, obviously, but really, I think most of history is more like a peasant aristocrat relationship. This middle merchant class, kind of middle class midwits, is a new development in my interpretation of history, coming post-Reformation and post-Industrial Revolution. And they've always been the ones encouraging the deracination of any traditions, and always fomenting revolution in order to gain more power to become the elite themselves.
Yeah, of course, the existence of the capitalists or the bourgeoisie as a significant force is relatively recent, like past 500-year phenomena. Of course, a class like that has always existed, but them being as prominent as they are is very recent historically. So yes, and yes, in both the American and French Revolution, those are some of the most clear instances in which they are bourgeois revolutions.
Yeah, you make a good point there, 21st reaction. And, the American founders, it's interesting. I definitely wouldn't call them midwits or even middle class per se, but they were certainly bourgeois. They weren't part of this older aristocracy, the old money or old power. And they were successful, very intelligent, and, self-made in the New World. But, no matter what their achievements, there's no amount of monetary or corporate or whatever success actually properly gives you access to the old aristocracy. So it was fundamentally a bourgeois phenomenon. America had no aristocracy, but then of course these bourgeois people did essentially become the new aristocracy, particularly in the South.
Well, just a little bit of nitpicking. Historically, middle class just meant bourgeoisie. In the Victorian period, especially, there were many people that were far richer than the nobility, but they were still considered middle class because of their social position.
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, middle class meaning it's also, of course, back then middle class was like 10% of the population, so it didn't mean it meant middle in terms of social and traditional social standing, not middle as in like the middle of the population.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed that Auron was possibly going to make a point, but after he makes his point, if he so chooses, I was wondering, what are you guys' opinions on what the bourgeoisie is in relation to this idea of demos? What is their position in any democratic system?
Okay, well, Auron, did you have a point you were going to make there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if you want to look at what the end goals were of the American Revolution, you can simply see that the Constitution was, of course, a right-wing reaction to the more popular interests of the revolution after Shays' Rebellion, they wanted to centralize more power inside the government and give them better control over farmers in case they decided to try to go after the bankers again. And so this is not. It's very clear that that was the end goal of those involved in the revolution at the highest levels.
So 21st, your question was basically, what is the relation between the bourgeoisie and the lower class in a democratic system?
I was just saying their position in general. How do they affect any democratic system? Because it's not as simple as high and low. Of course, there's this middle, and we usually like to picture it as the problem with democracy is that it's the high and low versus the middle. But we usually think of the middle as the people that go to NASCAR games, the kind of middle American, white working class, etc. But I'm really thinking of just purely middle class, urban professionals, possibly those kinds of people. I mean, one thing I personally observe is that the bourgeoisie, always are obsessing over the people above and below them. The people that goes to the NASCAR games do not think about their more culturally progressive counterparts in that are urban professionals or whatever. But they always have a superiority complex over these over low, and then they always have an aspiration thinking that they are like high, they are like the academics and the Hollywood celebrities. They're like that in that they're very progressive and high-minded and such.
Well, it's interesting, the role of the bourgeoisie, because what happened in the United States is that some element of the bourgeoisie did become the new aristocracy, and now in the United States we actually do have an old money aristocracy who is the true elite, and it's very limited, the capacity to which the bourgeoisie can access this. There's a period of time where wealth allowed you to form this new aristocracy in the United States, but eventually that was closed off. Certainly after sometime between the Civil War and perhaps the Second World War is when that period ended. And now you have this more or less permanent elite class that occasionally someone through sheer entrepreneurial might, like think of Jeff Bezos or Steve Jobs, right? These are people who came from nothing and became, truly elite status. Other than people like that, no matter how successful you might be at your business, you can't actually gain access to this elite. It's interesting that we talk about this because just last night I was watching Eyes Wide Shut. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that. It was Kubrick's last film. And that was a very interesting movie because it's very much about this topic. It stars Tom Cruise as a wealthy doctor, right? And he kind of touches at the bottom of the elite class. He's sort of invited to the parties and all of that, but he's never truly given access to their secrets or their levels. And he's basically just a high tier minion, right? And that's mostly the role that most of the bourgeoisie continues to play, and why they're sort of positioned against opponents on both sides, because their ultimate goal is to gain access to the aristocracy, but they're simply unable to do so because no true aristocracy is open for membership in a meritocratic sense. And this is interesting because in the United States we're not really supposed to have an aristocracy, and everything is supposed to be sort of based on this idea of individual achievement and meritocracy. But at the end of the day, we still have an elite in the U.S., and it's really just as closed off as any other elite that's ever existed in history.
That's true. Even in the feudal era, to be fair, I think joining the elite is probably a bit easier today. But it is still quite closed off. But even that is a bit irrelevant, the openness or closeness, because entership into the elite does nothing whatsoever to change the actual power structures at play. So like even if there was frequent shifting going on and there were new families entering the like richest 100 ever, and that of course doesn't happen, but even if that was happening very frequently, that none of that would change at all the power structures that exist. But yes, I mean, though I do think it's slightly more common now. Even in the Middle Ages, wealthy peasants would occasionally amass enough land or enough or enough assets or whatever to be able to ascend into the petty nobility. So the ability for some small group of people to ascend into the ruling classes, not a new phenomena. But sort of to 21st Reaction's point, it is really interesting how, I mean, this has been remarked upon many times, but it is interesting the sneering nature of the middle class. Both saying that this is something that has been recognized for a long time, and I'm not quite sure why this is the case. But we just had a very good example of this recently, where I can't remember who it was. One of the mainstream media journalists in the United States were making fun of Trump supporters, those Trump supporters that were having those like Trump boat parades, and said that these are college-educated whites who have enough disposable, or these are non-college educated whites who have enough disposable income to buy a boat. And he said, like, I don't know, he said that as though that's a bad thing that you're able to buy a boat without going to college. And that's one of the sort of biggest parts of elitism today, is among the middle class is the college elitism, like as if to be successful or to have a good life, everyone needs to go to college. But yes, I mean, I know there are various explanations for this, but the sort of sneering nature of the middle class is something that's very interesting.
Well, I think part of it comes from what I was talking about. I think there's a resentment in the middle class that they're sort of unable to penetrate these upper barriers that they may have thought they were going to be able to ascend past, simply by going to college or something like that, because that was one of the ways that you would normally get into the elites is going to a university, say 100 or so years ago, when admission to these things was very tight, and you basically didn't get into one unless you were extremely intelligent or from old money in the first place. So I think a lot of middle class people sort of expect that through some sort of achievement, they'll be able to become some form of elite, and find themselves unable to actually get past this ceiling over their head that it simply doesn't allow them to get through. So they look in the other direction and find some sort of satisfaction at pretending to be more aristocratic in some way than the people below them, simply due to the amount of dollars they have.
Yeah, and I don't think this is any small part of the civil unrest that we're seeing. Is the term that gets bandied about is overproduction of elites. We had that access offered, like Charlemagne was saying. You were promised that college was the key to the meritocracy. Of course, the meritocracy, you weren't really able to ascend it unless you had the money and the family connections to attend college, which was very rare pre-1940. But of course, a bunch of GIs come back after World War II. They get the GI Bill, they get access to college for the first time, and all of a sudden this becomes, in theory, a way for you to climb from the lower class to the middle class and the middle class to the upper class. But as time went on and the value of the degree falls, as more and more middle class people become credentialed, and credential just becomes part of the process of getting the middle class job, these people are still promised, going into college the last 20 years, that if they go 80, 100, $150,000 in debt, they'll be able to ascend to the ruling class. They'll be elites. But of course, we know that's not happening. And now we had a bunch of Starbucks baristas with really, expensive degrees, but they still want to sneer down at the people who don't have them. And so what you see is a lot of, $40,000 a year employees sneering at plumbers who are making $100,000 a year because they resent the fact that they weren't given access to the elite class.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Right.
And yeah. Oh, sorry, Charlemagne.
No, you go ahead.
I was just observing that perhaps it's not an overproduction of elites, I guess, and more like an overproduction of elitists. But it's such a great point to see their faith in institutions like the official press and, of course, academia, because they don't get their status from pure power like the elite does. In order to aspire to be elite, to be an elitist, they get all of their status and relevance from these major institutions that bestow it onto them. So I think this is one of the reasons why the middle class, the bourgeoisie that are much more culturally progressive than some people that are poorer than him, are such a solid faction for the progressives. It's because they get all their status from the institutions that really run the show.
To relate this middle class concept and bourgeois concept to the popular revolution, the myth of the popular revolution, what we have going on now is portrayed by the media as some sort of popular revolution by the oppressed people, against the racist ruling class or whatever. And what's actually going on here is it's not a popular revolution, but it's a jealous set of wannabe elites weaponizing the lower classes beneath them in the manner that we might describe as bio-Leninism against the actual aristocracy, in this matter that sort of slowly burns away at it and ultimately ends up with them becoming the new elite decades into the future, as we're seeing now. But of course, that you end up in this degenerated state where you have this even worse elite at the top of it. So I think right now we're certainly not seeing a popular revolution in any sense, even though you see hundreds or thousands of people out of these protests and whatever. None of what's happening really has anything to do with these common people. It's all about some other set of aspiring oligarchs trying to replace the existing oligarchy.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point for this topic, is the current protests quote unquote and stuff. But what's really interesting about this is you sometimes hear right wingers say stuff like, oh, right wingers should riot, right wingers should do the same thing that the BLM people are doing, and it's just like, you're so stupid. It's like, okay, if you, we know what they do. Like there was, I know these people are cringe, but there's stuff like the Tea Party protests where there's massive national protests back in 2008. And the media tried to smear them as horrible people and as violent and stuff when that clearly wasn't true, just because they didn't like them, and they barely had any ammunition to go with. Or Covington Kid is probably even a better example, where the worst they could find from massive pro-life protest was one kid smirking, so they tried to destroy the kid's life. The way that this street violence stuff is a very classic tactic. It's something we've seen all throughout the 20th century, especially from both the far left and the far right, where Italy, Germany, again, both sides of the political spectrum, there would be the people that would do the street violence would have people in the ruling class who would back them up, and basically the ruling class would unleash them directly or indirectly as their their muscle, and then when they would go before courts or stuff, the ruling class would use their influence to make sure that their people didn't get punished too hard. But the problem today is no type of right winger is anywhere in the ruling class to prevent this from happening to you. The entirety of the court system, the entirety of the legal system is very preferential towards groups like Black Lives Matter, and they're very unpreferential to any sort of right wing group of any, whether it's boomer cons or whether it's whatever else. They're going to throw the book at you if you do anything. We saw this with the Proud Boys very clearly. So I don't like street violence in general, so it's not like I would endorse it even if it was a good political strategy. But it's just stupid, and people that say oh, right wingers need to riot, you're you need to stop being stupid is the real answer.
Yeah, very well said. Because this is the whole problem with the fashion Natso types, is that regardless of how even if these ideas are good, they can't work. So they have to just be discarded pragmatically, because there is no path to power through this this type of means that you saw in the 30s and 40s in Europe. It's completely closed. Of course, that's Moldbug.
Moldbug talked about this in the open letter. He said, think really hardly about this. Is there a large reactionary ruling class that will back you up? It doesn't exist. I've talked to some of these brain dead people before, and I heard there was this racist professor once somewhere. Okay, yeah, based. That doesn't matter. There's a racist professor somewhere. Okay, I guess you're going to take over America.
Right, and you even see these rogue bourgeois eliminated as well. People like Kevin McDonald, right? Like even they can't survive in their tenuous positions. So what makes you think you as a street thug is going to do so, right? Just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's very annoying. I'd like to get to some super chats quickly. Not Omegon says for $2, what role does the military play in today's elite? And then the other super chat is mentioning this too, so I'll read that out. Diehard Doogie for $5 says the military is a servile class to liberalism.
Stormtroopers.
Yeah, I mean, I'd mostly agree with Diehard Doogie's assessment. I mean, I'm not American, so it's a bit harder for me to. We certainly do not have anywhere close to the military culture that you have in the United States. But it does not seem like the military is really the core of the ruling class to this day. Perhaps that's different when it comes to foreign policy.
Well, it was the core to its power, its initial seed of power, I think, through its conquest in Europe. But
yes, of course.
Ever since then, it and I'm talking about in 1945, right? Like we shouldn't forget that the United States and the other allies conquered Europe, right, and occupied it for quite a long time. It wasn't simply that we beat the Nazis and left, right? This was conquered territory, and so the military, in that sense, sort of solidified the regime through use of force. And now all the military is the U.S. military, of course, is really just the enforcer for the economic order that backs up the existing oligarchs.
Yeah, it's like it could be equated to like a company's security. It's not like they're not the ones making the decisions. Yeah,
exactly. It's security. Yeah, like someone goes rogue, like Gaddafi or something, trying to start his own gold standard. They get eliminated. Anyone that deviates from the allowed Overton bubble of economics gets whacked by the U.S. military. It's just an enforcer at this point. No disrespect, of course, to anyone in the military, but in terms of the purpose it serves in the regime, that's what it does. And then, of course, it also dissuades any sort of right-wing thuggery, as we discussed earlier. It's obviously impossible, right, with the military.
Yeah,
it's very interesting to see that the state of the absolute state of the military, where the higher up generals and those people in that clique are part of the general they're part of the general milieu of the cathedral itself. They're becoming less and less antagonistic to their partners, their supposed partners in the State Department and other bureaucracies, of course. It's very interesting to see that the military is the only one, the single successful avenue for the current regime to translate these middle American white working class, culturally conservative people that the bourgeoisie crap all over. It's the one avenue that they can translate them into good stormtroopers for the regime. It's kind of sad.
I also Diehard Doogie for $10 following up on this point just said, the military cannot be militaristic or promote a culture of conquest unless it's under the guise of liberty or freedom or gay rights. I serve in the Marines, by the way. I'm assuming that says Marines. It seems to be a typo.
Yeah.
Yes. But yes, I agree. I mean, as Charlemagne said, I do have respect for people that are in the military. And I'm sure Diehard Doogie does too, if he is one of those people. I always have to have some sort of Catholic reference, but as we see in the New Testament quite clearly, the Roman authorities were not the greatest people at the time, but Christ and the apostles are very respectful of centurions and other figures. So I do think it's important to understand there's a difference between the heroic soldiers and the decisions of the ruling class. But yes, it's very true. All the great things that the U.S. military does is all explicitly under the guise of bringing democracy or freedom or whatever. Whether it's direct conflicts or whether it's more indirect things. That's all the U.S. military is really able to celebrate in a big way.
Yeah, well, it's funny too, because one of the reasons the U.S. military is so effective at this is because it barely ever has to be used, right? And that might be that might seem kind of weird to say, given how the U.S. is just sort of perpetually involved in these conflicts. But we're involved in extremely low-level conflicts, right? Given the history of warfare, I mean, the United States mostly just has to have its big stick and occasionally just poke at various naughty bits of the world to keep them lined up. The military just sort of exists as this entity that enforces the order simply by being so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, compared to any other period in history, the U.S. military, the especially post World War II conflicts the U.S. military has been in would be considered a very modest amount of conflicts compared to any other point in U.S. history.
And even post Vietnam or post Desert Storm, right? Like we have 20 years of war in Afghanistan, right? But the scale of that is tiny compared to most of the other things that happened in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And I think you have to understand the large change that the military has undergone in the last 50 years. I have a lot of friends who served in our active duty, and just the big shift in the officer corps, especially those coming out of the military academies, those have really become more Ivy League than anything else. Moldbug talks about Red Empire and Blue Empire, and the only thing really under Red Empire's control is supposed to be the military and the Department of Defense. But as the cathedral has expanded, a larger and larger percentage of those at the highest echelon in the officer corps are more and more progressive or owe their allegiances and their power to progressive causes. And so a force that traditionally would have been relatively conservative has slowly drifted that direction, not really at the level of the average soldier, but at the level of those who actually command.
Right, which is the elite. The popular person in the military, the soldier, isn't what drives the ideology of the military any more than they drive the ideology of the regime in the country. Right, all that matters is the people at the top, really. And this is a little off the topic, but this is something I have thought about. Sort of the fact that the Red Empire is kind of just disappearing, isn't it? And it's going to be oops, all Blue Empire basically. And I think this is an artifact of the two-story state merging into a one-story state as the sort of Overton window of acceptable politics closes. You're going to see an end of this sort of two America system, and there's just going to be only Blue America left at some point.
Yeah, I've actually got a video set up for going up tomorrow, breaking down that Moldbug article. I know I'm not the first one to do that, but yeah, we're definitely seeing the final shift of the Republicans' narrative of the Constitution and freedom and liberty. It's now being folded into really the Democrat story of civil rights, and now the Republican Party is just becoming we can civil rights harder than you. And so what we're seeing is things like the military that used to be captured by Red Empire are really no longer available. Because the story, the narrative that would have driven them forward is not even being perpetuated by those in political power who are supposed to have their back.
Yeah, the one-story state situation, that kind of prediction seems very valid to me. Let me just introduce a possible counter to it. Do you think that this may just be another republic forming, a civil rights republic relative to the... a civil rights republic to be the next stage post New Deal republic, right? I think of when people talk about, perhaps the Republicans are going to have an electoral winter because of demographic change in the U.S. I'm like, that's plausible, but I could also consider it as just a new step, the next regime coming in, where the supposed opponents simply leap farther in the direction of where the regime wants to go. So the post-New Deal Republicans couldn't oppose the New Deal anymore. Okay, well, we'll focus on other things like states' rights or whatever. This new regime doesn't allow us to oppose the civil rights doctrine or any of that. So we'll just go to a new issue. Let's just try and lower taxes by 5% and have slightly more free trade, etc. I see that as a possibility, as just a new two-story state, except even lamer. Yeah, as history goes in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I alluded to earlier us being towards the tail end of the Fourth Republic, and I think we will see the Fifth Republic soon, and it will be a completely different regime. Although people might not realize it at first, it's I think very near upon us, and it's probably not going to be a regime to our liking. It's going to be an even worse one than the Fourth Republic of FDR. It's going to be the Civil Rights Republic or whatever. And
the Republic of AOC.
Yeah, the Republic of AOC. And we'll have two stories, but they'll both be lame stories that are quite oppressive to the people from the old regime.
The Moloch Republic.
But yes, I definitely agree. I do think there'll probably be like a short-term electoral winter for the Republican Party, where like a decade from now, the Texas will go blue, and then the Democrats will probably win like every election for 20 years, other than maybe losing the House a few times. But it will probably shift eventually to where the Republican Party will change its appeal a bit, and it will just things will just get worse and worse. That is that's how the American electoral system is very specifically designed in a way to make the existence of two parties favorable. So I think that probably will continue to exist. It's of course impossible to tell for sure though. But we have a super chat from Diehard Doogie on the same topic, so I'll read that now. For $20, he says, the most disgusting thing about war now is the use of drones and the lack of bayonets and shovels. Our military members will lack the necessary savagery and barbarism to ensure the appropriate respect is due. Yes. I mean, that's not something I really know anything about, to be honest. That's a bit outside my field of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, we're obviously moving more and more towards automated weapons, and it's reasonable to think at some point it's basically going to be robots v robots or drones v drones or whatever you want to call them. But I don't actually think the 21st century is going to be defined by geopolitics as the 20th was. I've heard the term has been described to me. It's geoeconomics instead, right? I don't really think we're going to see war between the great powers play out as it has in the 20th century, not in the way we normally think of it. I think we're going to see mainly economic conflict between the emerging multipolar world, and of course that world is the Anglosphere, China, Russia, and the EU. And I think these powers are going to vie in the economic space with the same, I would say, ferocity as the great powers vied in the Napoleonic and World Wars, but it's going to be economic and not military. So, yes, you might see drones used more and more, and war kind of lose its face. But I think war is going to become increasingly a smaller part of the global world order, and it's purely going to be economic war. And like someone said in the chat, because nukes exist, like war between the great powers, especially as China continues to modernize and Russia does as well, and the EU, it's just totally untenable, right? Like it can't really happen because it's the cost of even playing that game is just too high. So it's going to be economic conflict only, I think, and that's really where I think anyone who thinks of themselves as dissident right needs to be looking. It is not, how am I going to, how am I going to, fight the cathedral, in the typical way, like the fasci boys might, but how am I going to economically compete with this thing, or economically survive this new multipolar geoeconomic battle?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I did watch that last Academic Agent stream, so I'm not totally sure nukes do exist. I'm a joking YouTube. I do not believe in any conspiracy theories, of course. But yes, that's an interesting one if anyone wants to look into that. But yes, no, I agree. The sort of nukes and just the extreme advanced nature of militaries in general makes these big sorts of wars less likely. War more commonly seems to be something that's done to punish rogue states than to any of these sorts of large ones. Of course, if it ever does happen, we're going to be really screwed, and one can hope it won't happen. But yeah, it seems unlikely because the amount of World War II is a good example of this, where there was obviously massive amounts of destruction, but after the conflict was over, like the world was relatively okay. All things the economy was chugging along. The world didn't just collapse. If there was actually some massive war between China and the United States and nukes were used, that would be the end of the world as we know it. So yeah, it seems unlikely anything like that would happen again.
And prim accelerationism.
Yeah, I mean, you could have a war without nukes. I mean, obviously, some people think there's going to be a naval and air war with China, sometime in the near future, and it's definitely possible that there could be a small contained outbreak. But I think that would really be all there would be to it. If it did come to conflict, I think it would mostly just be our robots versus your robots, right? And right now, our robots, have people in them. Our fighter jets and our really advanced ships and aircraft carriers and all of that. But I don't think you would really consider it a major conflict, right? Like it would be major in the sense that you would probably lose billions of dollars or trillions worth of equipment on either side. But I don't think it would be particularly drawn out. And I think, honestly, the more likely thing is for the U.S. to just sort of slowly retreat towards its side of the Pacific and, confront China and the other powers economically. And you have to remember that it's not the U.S. versus China. It's the U.S. and China and Europe and Russia all playing this geoeconomic game together, right? Like the EU is not aligned with the Anglosphere, obviously. And Russia is obviously not aligned with China or the EU, right? These are all independent, pluralistic players. And I think that's going to be the new balance of powers that's going to keep this post-nuclear age stable.
Yeah, I think even more than the nukes, really. As long as American aircraft carriers are going around, I don't think anyone's going to be able to bring that level of of military might. That it's just not an option. No other country has the concentration of naval power that we do. And China's got its own stability issues. It's got to look to. It's got to make sure that it's got its own demographic problems. And so I don't think that they're looking for any direct confrontations anytime soon.
Right. There's really no reason to attack the United States, and the United States would be perfectly fine in any conflict that attempted to attack the homeland. Right. So even if the U.S. decides to accept its diminishing superpower status and just sort of retreat out of the South China Sea, if it comes to that, I mean, that's honestly not really a big deal. I mean, it's not necessary for the United States to rule the whole ocean, nor is it likely to continue indefinitely anyway. So I don't really think we should be particularly worried about that. And, I think it's clear that China isn't really interested in military conflict. Yes, they're attempting to modernize and build up their military, but I think this is just for basic regional power projection and not the precursor to some larger world war. The incentives just don't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, it is possible for countries to be run by irrational actors. I'm of course not saying that I support the war in Iraq, but I do think Saddam Hussein's a good example of this. Where if he would have just kowtowed to American hegemony, he would his family would still be in charge today. And that would have been the logical thing to do for someone in his position. But China is Xi Jinping does not strike me as the sort of crazy ideological dictator who's going to get into a fight that he can't win. And neither does the CCP in general. They seem pretty level-headed. They seem to know how to preserve their power. So that would have to change radically if for China to get itself into a conflict like that.
I think another, just to get back to the topic, another interesting area of popular revolution is South America in the 20th century. And those are all interesting to look at because those are all very much depending on the actors, funded by or supported by either side at the Cold War, and the United States certainly has played its part in regime change in that area of the world in the 20th century as well.
Yeah, that's true. I to be honest, my knowledge of 20th century South America is not particularly great. Any of you other two have anything to say about that?
Well, I just wanted to be honest, I'm proposing a new question here. I just wanted to ask, how should the dissident right go forward in terms of understanding that the democratic meme is a meme? It's a fantasy. I see very often, a discussion of we need to penetrate the mainstream. We need to convince more minds of our ideas and amass more people, more like-minded people, when I don't accept that. Really, what needs to happen is an elitist strategy of small group of people coordinating to accrue more wealth and power, and to also appeal to the mainstream of the minds of specific, rogue elite actors. That's why I think should be changing here. And although I do think the internet sphere of discussing things online and having great discussions that people listen in on and enjoy and develop an understanding through is very useful and very good, and it will be a historical example for us. Imagine if the coffee house discussions in Austria was recorded during the Enlightenment. But anyway, I think we need to figure out a new path other than literally having basically these billboard shops where we simply sell ideas to people and sell convincing more and more people on the internet to be.
Well, this is always a difficult question. It's, this is what I do because this is what I can do. I'm some dude from Canada. I don't have elite connections. I know that sucks. If elites want to spot me and, if they want to, become based tradcaths and try and take over America with based trad Catholicism, okay, that's cool. But I don't have any connections. So just like spewing out into the internet, my opinions is all I really have. But yeah, it's I agree, of course, because influencing elites is how, this is kind of the point of the stream, of course. Influencing elites is how you control change in general. Whether it's a revolution or whatever. When a change happens, it's almost always because there's a small group of elite who want that change to happen. The issue is just most of us probably have no contact with those types of people whatsoever. And Moldbug is, of course, interesting because he does actually have contact with some types of people, at least a little bit. But for most of us, I don't know if there even really is much we can do directly yet, at least.
Yeah,
I wasn't dismissing the internet sphere. I just wanted to say that it's very valuable as a historical testament. 100 years from now, it will be very interesting to see this.
Assuming it's not erased, but I take more. I'm very clear-pilled, as we say on this, and I don't think there's any way at the moment to actually attempt to do this sort of alternate power structure, rogue elite business that we've talked about before. Just because this is always just completely closed. There is no way to get power to flow that doesn't flow into the cathedral. I think I really like the Persuasion and the Mensheviks article that Moldbug just wrote. I mean, I think the only thing we can really do at the moment is continue to put forward ideas and state very clearly what our particular solutions are to the problem, and that they might not all be the same. But I think the one thing we do need to be clear about is that the solution to the current regime is a new regime. It's not fixing the regime in any way. There is no path of repair out of our problems. It has to be completely replaced. And I think until people are ready to accept that replacement, there's simply no amount of effort in terms of trying to gain actual power that is actually going to do anything. I think it's one of those things where you just need to make yourself heard and just play the patient waiting game, basically, and wait for people to open up. I mean, I think in some sense we actually do want to get our ideas out to as many people as possible, just so that they even know that there's another way to think about the problems we're having. And if those ideas are in their head, they potentially can become open to it one day. And I mean, you have to imagine that there are obviously plenty of conservative people who are totally fed up with the U.S. government, and all it really takes is for them to get sufficiently fed up with it to actually accept a regime change that is in the right-wing direction. That's all we're really waiting for. But it's not something I think we can actually hope to achieve top down, because you have to actually think about the end game, right? If we're gonna slowly accumulate power in this Gramscian fashion where we attract rogue elites and build up our base over time. I mean, how is that actually going to work, right? Like, why would the cathedral possibly tolerate this obvious and naked attempt to undermine its sovereignty? It simply won't. I think its sovereignty has to more or less vanish due to the people it depends on for sovereignty simply no longer recognizing it, kind of like what happened in the Soviet Union.
Well, and I think the thing to remember is that we're really weathering a storm, not leading a popular revolution, which is the subject of the stream. You got to remember, I think it was you, Charlemagne, on Twitter a few days ago, you were talking about one of the reasons the right has a hard time coming together is it's not really a collection of people with the same ideology. It's more a bunch of different people got red pilled and we all got dropped into this situation, and we're all just trying to figure out what's going on. And in danger of extending the metaphor too far. In the Matrix, the only reason that the humans can do anything is they have a literal Jesus figure helping them fight back, right? In a realistic as the Wachowskis could be, but in a realistic version of that story, the humans don't just take back the power in a couple of years. You have to build, you have to bring people together, you have to find a way forward, and the first thing you have to do is survive the onslaught from people who are far more powerful and have no incentive to let you back in. And so the thing we have to remember, and no one wants to hear it, everyone wants to say, I can do this right now. We can go out there and we can change it right now. We can stop this. We can make things better. That's what everybody wants. The hard thing to hear is, it's going to be difficult and things are going to get worse. But if we do the hard work now, our children might be able to benefit from what we do. And that we have to understand that's where we are.
Yeah, and I'll even add a few more sprinkles of black pill to that. I think we have to accept that, the Fifth Republic is coming and it's going to be awful. And we're looking at the Sixth Republic, right? We're not looking at the fifth one. We basically already lost the game. Okay, the game is over. And right now we're trying to prepare for the next game so that we can win that one. We can't. I think it's not a black pill though. It's actually white pilling to actually come to this realization so that you can cease struggling needlessly against something that has already beaten you. Right? Like, we've been beaten, but we can come back and we can win the next game. But in order to do that, you have to stop fighting the current game that is already completely lost, asymmetrical, closed off to you. There's no way to actually win this chess match that we're in. So
I really largely agree with all the responses that Charlemagne was giving. I would say, although of course it couldn't be Gramscian and it couldn't be large alternative institutions that could possibly threaten the cathedral, they'd clearly crush that. But I'd say not only weathering the storm of the Fifth Republic, but it should be you hiding in the shadows, accruing power. Perhaps wealth is one avenue for that, but trying to accrue some kind of independence from the current regime, that you might be able to leave and return the country if need be, or just accumulate something like some kind of power and perhaps wealth. I would say that's one strategy. And then the second possible counter to Moldbug's kind of clear pill response is if we think of these situations like Canon Hinnant and that new Cuties Netflix thing. I think the clear pill is totally true and reasonable. But what are we going to say and do in the Fifth Republic when this stuff becomes normalized and life becomes much more dangerous for the average person, to the equivalent, to the level of, you know, Brazilian gangs, etc.? What, even though we would know we would probably lose, what will we accept in our faces at that time?
I mean, the reality is, it's, you know, I agree with a lot of what's been said. There's no short-term political solutions. We're not going to, like, there isn't going to be the based uprising where we're going to undo all the damage that's been done. And I, you know, I'm mostly, you know, clear pilled, grill pilled, all that type of stuff. Yes, as I feel like, you know, broken record player, but as I always say, just like get a wife, pray the rosary, and grill. That's all we really can do. But of course, the problem that you're saying, 21, is that they're not just, like, it's not just, we're not just abstaining from politics. They're bringing politics to us. They're not just bringing politics to us. They're not just bringing high tax rates to us. They're trying to do all sorts of stuff that we just can't allow, like the QT stuff. We just can't allow that. So I mean, you know, obviously the most practical answer is we need to be as withdrawn from any of these sorts of things as possible. You know, cancel your Netflix subscription. I mean, if I ever have children, you know, I hope I have children, but not quite there yet. I will definitely not allow them to have unrestricted internet access until, I don't know, they're 18 probably. It's just like you need to be as withdrawn from these things as possible. Because they're going to continue shoving this down their throat. I mean, for that matter, I don't think I'd watch my children watch cable TV. I don't know, they'll have to watch like shows from the 1950s on repeat, I guess. But it's just, that is, you know, there's always like move to Eastern Europe, move to Equatorial Guinea, these types of things. And maybe those types of things can be beneficial for some people. But the reality is every single social conservative in the West isn't going to leave the country they live in.
I'm sorry to extend this is largely a tangent and interruption, but I want to reinforce the point. I'm not just talking about terrible stuff on TV, isolated incidents of hate crimes, etc., whatever terrible stuff. When Charlemagne says the Fifth Republic is going to be more ugly and disturbing on a new level that's incomparable to the New Deal regime, I completely agree. It will be in your face. It will be very, very disgusting. If we think that, you know, millions of children in the womb being aborted now, we accept that in the face of that, what, even though you know that you would lose the battle, what would you feel if you did not fight back in the face of mass killing of people, of the complete deracination and destroying of the souls of children, perhaps your own children, in your very face? What will those people accept at that point in time, even if they knew they would lose?
Well, I mean, we need to resist it as much as we can, but there's just like there's a point to which, you know, we can't resist it. It's like if they're going to force this, if there's no reasonable opposition, you know, no reasonable way through opposition to stopping it, then the choice is to move or to try to resist it as much as possible.
I mean, certainly what I'm against is going out in a blaze of glory, right? Because like
yes, of course, I'm sure none of us are advocating like any sort of violent revolution.
I don't mean violent. I mean any sort of, you know, self-destruction, like, you know, as happens to people all the time, right? Like, you know, Kevin McDonald we mentioned earlier, right? Like he basically went out in a blaze of glory. Not like I'm blaming him or anything, but people just get destroyed, right, through fighting this thing. And there's no reason to sort of immolate yourself, because at the end of the day, the right thing to do is to win, to beat this thing. And that means you have to do whatever is going to be necessary to win, not just what you know, Moldbug writes about this in some of his Gray Mirror stuff, is that you don't want to be resisting just because it gives you some, you know, rush of power or validation or whatever in doing so, some sort of righteousness, because at the end of the day, the only point of any of this is to win, right? Like we must defeat this thing, and that may mean enduring things we really do not want to face in order to get through it. And it's actually, this isn't just power lust, right? It's the right thing to do, to take the path of victory over what we're fighting, and not to simply make some sort of moralistic stand, because at the end of the day, that's more or less the same as just giving into the thing, because you're simply allowing it to beat you for no reason.
Yeah,
It's I think ancient Rome is again instructive here in the Bible. Romans 13, be subject to the governing authorities and pay on to Caesar, give on to Caesar what is Caesar's. There's just it. Of course, our governments are uniquely evil in ways in which the Roman Empire wasn't, but there are many ways in which the Roman Empire at that period were very evil, that one would think would be very difficult for a Christian to cooperate with, and was. Many of them were killed. And there's certain things you can just never submit to, but you do need to. At the end of the day, this isn't even like a moralistic statement. This is just a fact. You need to be subject to the governing authorities. There's no option about that. It's what has to happen at the end of the day.
Well, and you can't work to shape the views and values of the next generation if you don't have them. If you're unemployable, if you can't hold a job, if you can't make a living, if you can't have a family, if you can't be part of your church, then you can't carry those values forward. You can't change the next generation. And so while it's very tempting to fight with all your might, making a martyr of yourself means taking your values out of the next generation. It means making sure that you can't participate. And so while the glory of making the big change is what most people want, the immediacy of that is great in theory. What really is going to make the difference, especially when you're in our position, is being sure that you're around to inculcate the next generation with those values. So when the time comes, there is actually a decent sized block of people who are looking to that kind of worldview.
I completely agree with all these points. And like I said, the clear pill is correct. We cannot react in an irrational way to embody the frame, to embody the boogeyman that the current cathedral regime is hoping that we are. I understand all that. All this is the logical strategy would not to be do that. What I'm thinking is that if you think of the quote from Nick Fuentes, where he's talking America first is inevitable, because he predicts there would be a visceral reaction, a visceral popular reaction to the Fifth Republic. I think that's a decent prediction. I would think that if they, for example, well, actually, they wouldn't do that. But if I believe that they would probably ban homeschooling, compulsory state education, and we know the direction they're going in terms of what they're going to put into kids' minds and everything. I'm just thinking that it's possible that there would be some kind of visceral popular reaction to all of this in the coming decades in a way that we might never expect.
That's possible, but I'm glad you bring that up, because that brings us back to the topic. And I think I kind of just have less faith in people than perhaps Nick Fuentes does.
I'm people pilled.
Yeah, I mean, I really just, it's hard for me to see this happening. I think there will be some level of reaction, I think, that eventually gets us to a better regime. But I think that the time scale for this might be a lot longer than any of us might think. I mean, one way we might have to think of ourselves as is the 19th century early socialist philosophers who never lived to see any socialist regime materialize on the planet, right? I mean, this might be the time scale we're working on here in terms of bringing forward something we would describe as a reactionary regime. And I mean, maybe the Fifth Republic won't last that long, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm very skeptical in the existing generation of conservatives that they will actually be able to muster any popular revolution. Basically, I don't really believe in the popular revolution, I think.
Yeah. I mean, for the point you're making, a good quote from Mao Zedong is he once was, I don't know if this is even a real quote, but this is attributed to him. He was once asked about the French Revolution, what his opinions on it were, and he said it was too soon to tell. And it's, you know, that's the place we're at now. Everything, I mean, you know, everything going on now, even the FDR revolution. Where will this all end up? It will take, I don't know, maybe 1,000 years to really understand. But yeah, I mean, we just need to survive. There's this really good quote from this boomer trad Catholic YouTube channel I watch occasionally called Tumblr House. One of them said, "Stay sane inside insanity." That's kind of I think our chief goal.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the reference to China there is interesting, just because, you know, China is one of the oldest civilizations in the world, and their time horizon for understanding history is tends to be much larger than that in of the West. And you know, perhaps there's some wisdom there in taking that outlook on things. I think we're kind of used to rapid change in the West over the last several hundred years, but you know, the rapid change is all in one direction, really, and we can't expect that this process is just going to suddenly reverse itself, sort of on just a physical level. It doesn't really make sense for you know, this great machine to come screeching to a halt and reverse in the other direction. And if it did, it would probably be really dangerous, right?
That's the meme of the outer party, right? If you elect us, if we win this election, this is our opportunity to finally win. Donate again. Every time they do that, where we're on the brink of reversing history, and of course it never happens. But yeah, I agree. I actually think a visceral reaction would happen in the long term. It wouldn't just happen in the next 2 decades or so. It would be a more long process. I'm just wondering, is there a breaking point to how people are conditioned to separate from the natural law? How far are you able to go with that? Kind of like with the economic situation where, you know, centralized banks and the Federal Reserve, they're thinking of QE infinity as an infinite printing money. How far do you have to distance yourself from reality before just the base root instinct in a man just reacts to it, and the economy crashes and the regime crashes?
I think that actually is a good point, because one of my sort of core criticisms of like Soviet communism is that it essentially was trying to go to war with reality, which is you know, criticism of many of the left in general. It's something I've said about left in general, but especially Soviet communism. They're trying to go towards economic reality. And you know, I'm not like an Austrian. I'm not like a free market fundamentalist or anything. But there, you know, there is when you're on, like, you know, Stalin pilling it, that just doesn't work. Trying to run an economy like that, it just the reason why the Soviet Union fell, and the reason why every communist country fell, was because the options they had was to either stop doing insanity, or to stop the decision they had is they had to stop being communist. So they could either give up communism entirely, like Russia, or they could keep a communist party in power but give up the state socialism that they're trying to pursue. It just, what they were doing was so contrary to how reality actually functions that it couldn't work out. So I do think that's a good point, and that there are certain things perhaps that the left pursues that is just so contrary to reality that cannot be maintained. That is probably true with certain things. I don't think that would be necessarily a popular uprising, though. That would just be a sort of natural backlash of just reality reasserting itself, not the peasants reasserting themselves.
Right, and I think this will happen. It just the time horizon might be a bit longer than we think, but this popular backlash will be the sort of bread and butter of the transition to the next elites, because they will utilize this as a weapon, as all revolutionaries have. They will weaponize sentiment of backlash against the existing oligarchs in a truly disruptive manner. Trump hasn't even come close to being able to do this, right? So this ultimately, I think, the conflict that the cathedral has with reality will eventually be its undoing. But I think we have a lot more reality to burn through before we get there.
Yeah, that's probably true. Of course, again, the analogies are always limited. The violating economic reality is it's much easier for reality to reassert itself with that than it is for certain other topics. But another 2 super chats. Mr. Texas Preacher for $10 says, "But what happens if the United States begins to balkanize?" Thoughts? I honestly, I feel like this topic, the U.S. balkanizing, has been done to death. I just see absolutely no incentive whatsoever for the central government to ever allow that. I think would be really good. I wish it would happen. If you could have a literally a blue America and a red America as separate states, I think that would be like one of the most positive outcomes for us. If it could split up like that, but I just see no reason possibly why the central government would ever allow that. And yeah, so it's just I don't see why it would ever happen.
And even further, I see the opposite happening. I think there's incentive for greater union between the Anglosphere, particularly Canada and Britain, as these economic blocs form as the new pluralistic world order. I think we're going to see even tighter integration with Canada and Britain and Australia and a few other of these. Japan as well would be in this Western Anglo economic bloc, I think, that will form to oppose these other major world powers. So, and I think that might include something you might recognize as a sort of American version of the European Union potentially.
I'm going to do a hat trick and tie it to one of the earlier topics. The reason that Balkanization is impossible and there would never be a split of these governments is the same reason that bourgeoisie, culturally progressive person always obsesses and thinks about that person that goes to the NASCAR game, and it's never the reverse. As Moldbug would say, the existence of a right winger or a reactionary or a conservative anywhere is a threat to a progressive's mind, and it is a threat to their entire belief system, in that the existence of them goes against their basic beliefs about their egalitarian universalism, kind of in the sense that because it is a universalist ideology, that means everyone will eventually accept it. So this is always the problem they'll have, and they'll never let go of you.
Yes, I agree with that. The left, I think a good way of describing this is the left really has a missionary spirit, and they just cannot tolerate the idea that there are people somewhere that are not willing to accept the latest developments in the in LGBT stuff or whatever. It's why I think it was 21 said earlier that you think homeschooling will be banned. That is quite likely. That could happen eventually. That would probably be a red line for me, in the sense that if that would happen, I would definitely have to move to a different country.
I agree solely, completely. That's amazing.
Yeah, or at least if I have children, if I decide to become a monk or something, then I might be willing to live it out. But I just for that to happen, the schooling system would have to get even more worse also. So it's just something I don't think I could permit my children to go through. But yes, in another super chat, Jedi Knight Anything Cringe Walker, pointing out self-awareness develops at age 2 to 4, and a newborn can't take care of itself, forces pro-choicers to admit that they should be allowed to kill newborns. It exposes them as insane to the average Joes. I mean, I agree that your point's like good and everything. But this is, kind of a bit of a democratic meme that like, oh, it exposes them to the average Joes. Like, the people that make policy don't care what the average Joes think. Or to the extent they do care, they care about they make policy and then they influence the average Joes. I mean, we've seen this a million times. I mean, Roe v. Wade is a great example of this, where the courts were the ones that had to force this through. So I agree. I mean, I agree that's a good argument, that none of the pro-choice arguments are at all consistent. The only consistent argument you can really make for pro-choice is consequentialism. Human life has no inherent value, and a society that kills babies is just a better society because it leads to better outcomes for women or something. That's the only outcome that like even slightly makes that's the only argument that even slightly makes sense from the pro-choice perspective, in my opinion. But you go ahead.
To me, like if you want to just BTFO the pro-choice people, the easiest way to do it is just to point out that as scientific understanding of prenatal development has advanced, like it's completely BTFO'd the pro-choice argument and demonstrated pretty clearly that these are human beings in there and not just some sort of unrecognizable entity. Like so there's no. Even within their own paradigm, the whole concept, like you really do have to fundamentally not value human life to.
Yes, I mean the intelligent pro-choicers explicitly do that. They say, "I do not see any fundamental value in human life." I know I was planning on making a response video to Destiny on this very topic, where he says that he used to be pro-choice. But the problem he got to is he's like an atheist or agnostic or something, and he never could think of any rational reason why all human life should have any sort of inherent value. So that's why he became pro-choice. So I mean that's logically consistent. It's monstrous, but it is logically consistent. But that's where you have to go. Is you have to say that if you want to have a logical argument for pro-choice, you have to admit that you believe human life does not have inherent value. And I do agree. I don't think that's something you can get people en masse to agree to, at least not with how people's mindsets are currently. That's something that like thoughtful left-wingers will say. But I doubt you could get like 50% of the public saying human life does not have inherent value.
that would be a hat trick. Sorry, what was that?
Yeah, that was my point on that topic.
Well, I was thinking in that frame of mind, and then including the point Charlemagne is making about having a longer time horizon. If you think of your grandfather and think of him as a frame of reference relative to where we are socially on all these issues, are any of you guys able to extrapolate how we might be the future grandfather and what that would look like? And it might be even a bit faster because we can see that the process that's happening here is accelerating a bit on these social issues. Do you see how you might be the grandfather? What kind of other side of the time horizon would you be seeing if this regime still existed?
If it existed for my entire life, you mean?
Right. In the same way that your grandfather was alive all the way up till now, and obviously there was some dramatic changes of transgenderism, as example, very, very recent. What would you see as you were all old and wizened and had gray hair?
I mean, I would probably just see the same thing I see now, just more of it, right? I would have experienced the nature of history that we've observed in terms of this pattern of decline. Instead of just intellectually understanding it, I would empathetically understand it. I mean, that's where I see the end of the time horizon being.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have much of an answer on this. Aaron, you've been quiet for a while. Do you have anything to say with that topic or something else?
I would just say that I think that really relates to something we were talking about earlier. There's only so long that a regime that is so out of contact with reality can continue in the manner it's going. I don't think we'll see the popular revolution. I don't think I think individual people are pretty malleable and will do what they need to do to survive and kind of keep their current situation going. And so individual people can be pushed pretty far. But I have a hard time seeing the regime as a whole continuing to exist with just its continued disconnect from reality. Maybe it'll be economic, maybe it'll be military, maybe it'll be some other sphere. But at some point, the current regime just not functioning according to basic laws of nature it's going to be a problem. It's going to have a break. and that's when we'll see the big change come. I don't know when that'll come, but I'm skeptical that it'll take to the point where we're grandparents. To be honest, I just have a hard time understanding how the regime can continue to function the way it does, with being that out of contact with reality.
I think one thing I would add to 21st Reaction's question is, what I wouldn't want to be thinking at the end of it is something like, at least I tried. I would want to think, did I choose the right actions? And sometimes the right action is to stop thrashing and to not do anything and to contemplate what you're actually doing and think about, whether or not. And then this is something we can do now. Think about, have we actually been doing the right thing? And what we call the dissident right as a whole. And I think the answer is in large part just no. I think, that's also a tough pill to swallow. But I think it's pretty clear that we haven't done the right things at all leading up until this point. In particular for all of the energy that's been put into politics and put into Donald Trump in particular. These are all just the wrong things to do, I think. And we need to take stock of that and contemplate what we should actually be doing. We sort of have this attitude on the dissident right that we have to do stuff. We have to just do things, just sort of throw darts randomly. Basically, this is what Auron referenced earlier that I was talking about on Twitter the other day. But I think we actually have to question that sort of fundamental assumption that we have to do something. I think there are times when something is exactly what you shouldn't be doing. What you should be doing is contemplating and planning and reconsidering whether or not your actions and strategy up to this point has actually made sense at all. And I think in large part it actually has not. And we need to actually fully take that on board to move forward.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I know, bringing back to FDR, one thing that normies will often say if you attack FDR about any of the economic things he did is at least he did something. And I mean, that's just like stupid. And I'm no economist. I'm not the type of person that's fit to really deeply criticize the economic things that he did. But the idea that like doing something is always a good, it's just totally fallacious. Like why would you expect that action is always better than inaction? If your action, if you have cancer and your action is to like cut off your arm by yourself, like that's probably not the best way of going about it. Sometimes sometimes you need to wait and take stock of these things. So yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah, and bad answers are actually worse than wrong answers are actually worse than no answers for us right now in our position. The things that we do wrong strengthen the cathedral. And so it's not, making those mistakes they don't just go into the void. They're not just a waste of our time. They actually have the opposite intended purpose. And so we have to keep that in mind when we feel that impulse to be important, like Moldbug talks about that, that impulse to matter. We have to remember that doing it the wrong way is actually hurting our cause. It's not just wasting our time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard for people to suppress that motive. Like, Moldbug makes this analogy to Eros and the he basically links the desire for power and to matter to this sexual desire. And I think that's a pretty apt analysis, and it's important to learn to suppress this stuff. And obviously we all fail at that, and it's really hard to do this in the face of all the nonsense we're seeing. Like just the other day, I was spurging out on Twitter about the cuties thing, but it's at some level sometimes you just can't help yourself, and we're all going to do that at some point. It's no one's ever going to navigate this thing perfectly, but at the same time we do need to be thinking about at every single moment, like what actually are we doing? What exactly is the goal, the accountability, the plan here? Because just sort of thrashing at the problem, particularly thrashing in this popular manner is not really a good idea, because one other thing Moldbug points out is not to support unaccountable causes, and that's very much what the whole populism thing is in the United States. We have this massive, vaguely right-wing, unaccountable social movement going on, and just sort of blindly contributing to that is probably about as dumb as the protesters showing up to some random protest and empowering, Antifa thugs with their massive bodies. We don't want to be those tools to the regime.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, anyone that's watching, one thing that you can do to help is donate to Settlers Lament. Subscribestar.com/Settlers Lament. Sorry, just always got to get that grift in there. But yeah, I don't know. I'm feeling like this is kind of wrapping down. Does anyone have anything else to say, or?
It is time to grill.
Well, make sure to everyone make sure to subscribe to everyone here, especially I'm sorry, Auron. How do you pronounce that?
Auron.
Auron. Okay. Auron. Make sure to subscribe to Auron and 21st Reaction. Thank you everyone very much for watching, and thank you very much for the super chats. And yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.